Carbs are the major cause of insulin resistance. That is a very popular claim you may have come across, as it is often repeated on social media and in numerous nutrition books. The assertion is that if you eat a high-carb diet, then your blood sugar and blood insulin levels will rise after every meal, and over time the body will become numb to the constantly elevated insulin levels. In other words, you will become insulin resistant. And you may have asked yourself, could this be true? Am I giving myself insulin resistance by eating bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, and fruit? In this video, we will discuss whether eating a diet rich in carbohydrates indeed causes insulin resistance. Hello everyone, my name is Mario, and on this channel we are discussing evidence-based information about nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic disease. This is the second video about the causes of insulin resistance. In the first one, linked up there, I discussed the role of visceral fat, ectopic fat, and low-grade chronic inflammation in the development of insulin resistance, and introduced a concept called the personal fat threshold. I definitely recommend you check that video out if you're interested in the causes of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Now, insulin resistance is not in all cases linked to extra body fat and low-grade inflammation. You may have heard on YouTube, social media, or in certain diet books that insulin resistance is the result of chronically elevated insulin levels, which we call hyperinsulinemia. And hyperinsulinemia is suggested to be the result of excessive consumption of high-carb foods. The suggested mechanism is that if we eat a high-carb diet rich in foods such as bread, rice, potatoes, corn, pasta, fruit, and starchy vegetables, our blood sugar levels rise after every meal. And to deal with such a rise in blood sugar, our body produces insulin, which causes our blood insulin levels to increase as well after every meal we eat, typically several times per day. And the hypothesis is that such an up and down in blood insulin levels again and again causes insulin resistance in people eating high-carb diets. One way we could think about this is that if the cells in our body are constantly exposed to high levels of insulin, they become kind of numb to its effect. And then, once we are a little bit insulin resistant, our body tries to compensate by making more insulin in response to each meal. And that again would make insulin resistance even worse. So by eating a high-carb diet, we basically set up a vicious cycle where we develop insulin spikes that then cause insulin resistance, which makes the spikes worse, which causes more insulin resistance. That is the theory. In this video, we're looking at whether there is scientific evidence to support this theory that hyperinsulinemia and dietary carbs are a cause of insulin resistance. The main reason this is an important question is that if carbs are indeed a major cause of insulin resistance, then lowering carb intake would be an important strategy to reduce our risk of insulin resistance and associated chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes. We'll address this theory by first looking at whether elevated insulin levels indeed cause insulin resistance, and then by reviewing the scientific literature on whether consuming high-carb diets indeed causes insulin resistance, and vice versa, whether low-carb diets improve insulin sensitivity. Let's first review the evidence to address the question of whether hyperinsulinemia causes insulin resistance. I'm aware of two lines of evidence that can shed some light on this question. The first is from hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp studies, CLAMP for short. And the second is based on patients suffering from a condition called an Insulinoma. Hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp and Insulinoma probably sound like terrible gobbledygook to you, but no worries, I'll try to guide you through this step by step. Let's look at whether insulin resistance can be the result of hyperinsulinemia in a clamp study. The first line of evidence is data from hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp studies. Let's first take this monstrosity of a term apart so that you no longer need to be afraid of it. First of all, a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp is a clinical procedure used to measure insulin sensitivity. It is very involved and requires considerable expertise, so it's almost only done in the context of research studies. Hyperinsulinemic means high insulin concentrations in blood. How high is not precisely defined, just higher than the normal fasting concentration. During such a clamp study, this is achieved by infusing insulin into blood continuously, usually for several hours. Now, if you've watched my prior videos in this series on the regulation of blood sugar, you know that insulin is a hormone, and if you infuse it into the blood in high concentrations, then it will do two things. One, it will stop the release of glucose by the liver that occurs in the fasting state. And second, it causes the cells of the muscle and fat tissues to take up glucose from the blood. The result of these two actions is that blood glucose levels drop. This is where the second part of the term comes in. Euglycemic clamp means that during the clamp test, blood glucose levels are kept within the normal range. This is achieved by measuring blood glucose levels constantly and infusing small amounts of glucose into the blood to clamp blood glucose within the normal range. Clamp here simply means we are keeping blood sugar levels constant. From this procedure, researchers can use various techniques to determine during the test how sensitive the liver, muscle and fat cells are to the actions of insulin. No need to explain this here any further. If you'd like to understand the details of how this is done, please visit the blog post associated with this video. For here, suffice to say that this is the gold standard measure of insulin sensitivity in healthy people. But why am I mentioning this? Does this tell us something about the causes of insulin resistance? Yes, potentially. 2 published studies show that after many hours of maintaining elevated blood insulin and normal blood glucose levels during such a clamp, the body becomes gradually more and more insulin resistant. One study observed that after 4 days of continuous hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, insulin sensitivity was reduced by 20 to 40% in healthy young people. Now, 4 days is very long, but another study found that at 40 hours of hyperinsulinemic clamp, in which insulin levels were kept at about the same level as that seen in obese men and women, also caused insulin resistance. There is another area of scientific research that provides additional evidence that elevated insulin levels could be a cause of insulin resistance, and that is based on research showing that insulin resistance is a result of a medical condition called insulinoma. An insulinoma is a benign tumor of the pancreas that leads to overproduction of insulin. Depending on the size of the tumor, the amount of insulin produced throughout the day may be only slightly elevated or several-fold higher than in healthy people. Because insulin suppresses the production of glucose by the liver and also enables muscle and fat cells to take up glucose from the blood, the main clinical expression of insulinomas is hypoglycemia, that is, low blood sugar levels. If insulinoma patients remained perfectly insulin sensitive, then they would potentially die due to severe hypoglycemia. However, they do not remain perfectly insulin sensitive. Several clinical studies have shown clearly that these patients become quite insulin resistant as a result of their condition. In conclusion, does hyperinsulinemia cause insulin resistance? If we consider the evidence from clamp studies and insulinomas together, these do strongly suggest that high insulin levels could be a cause of insulin resistance, at least in situations where chronic hyperinsulinemia persists for many hours to days. There are some potential limitations with this research, as I explained in more detail in the blog post associated with this video, but my conclusion would still be that chronically elevated insulin levels are likely the cause of insulin resistance in these situations. The one question that remains unclear, and this is an important consideration, is whether the normal up and down in blood insulin levels that occurs when we're eating meals rich in carbohydrates may similarly trigger insulin resistance. I'm saying this because neither clamps nor insulinomas are normal physiological conditions. In clamp studies and in insulinoma patients, we have persistently high insulin levels for hours to days, and the impact of chronic hyperinsulinemia may very well be quite different from the usual ups and downs in insulin levels that occur in people eating high-carb meals. Therefore, while I feel that this literature provides evidence that chronically elevated blood insulin levels likely cause insulin resistance, it remains unclear whether this also applies to dietary carbohydrate-induced temporary increases in insulin. What we therefore need to do is evaluate the scientific evidence from clinical feeding studies in which participants consumed diets varying widely in their carbohydrate content. The specific questions we are interested in are whether high-carb diets cause insulin resistance and whether low-carb diets improve insulin sensitivity. There are numerous studies that show a substantial increase in insulin sensitivity in people consuming low-carb, very low-carb, or ketogenic diets. However, some of the most frequently cited studies do not control calorie intake and weight change, and in those studies, participants improve their insulin sensitivity while also losing weight. Now, don't get me wrong, this is practically relevant as it demonstrates a key benefit of low-carb diets, namely that people tend to lose weight and fat mass when they eat low-carb. But these studies cannot tell us whether the improvement in insulin sensitivity is the result of the reduced carb intake per se, or the reduction in body weight and fat mass. As we discussed in the last video about the personal fat threshold hypothesis, visceral and ectopic fat are major drivers of insulin resistance, and even a few pounds of weight loss in people eating low-carb diets could explain an improvement in their insulin sensitivity. I therefore looked for dietary intervention studies in which A. participants consumed diets differing substantially in their carb content, B. in which insulin sensitivity was measured, and C. in which the impact of the diet composition on insulin sensitivity could be separated from the impact of body weight loss. That last point means that there were either no weight changes in either group because calorie intake was controlled, or that the dietary study arms were matched for calorie intake and weight loss. I summarized those studies comparing the body weight independent impact of high-carb versus low-carb studies on insulin sensitivity in this table here. Now, I'm not going to discuss each of these studies in every detail. I've done that in the blog post. The link is, as always, in the description box below. I invite you to read through that if you'd like to know all the details and understand my individual critique of each study. That is also where you find all of the references. For this video, I'll just give you a high-level overview of the major results from each study. Here in the first column, this is the name of the first author and the year of publication. In the second and third columns, I show the carb content of the low-carb diet and the high-carb diet tested in the study. This is expressed in percent of total energy intake. So what you will see readily is that people ate very few carbs on the low-carb diet and mostly carbs on the high-carb diet in most of these studies, except maybe in that last study here by Sachs and colleagues. So we have a nice difference in carb intake between the study diets in most of these intervention trials. The fourth column shows how insulin sensitivity was measured, and as you see, most used the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp that we discussed before. That is the gold standard measurement of insulin sensitivity, so this is really good. In the fifth column, I show the duration of the intervention phases, the sample size and the study design. Many of these studies were relatively short, but others used diet intervention durations of up to 12 months, so that's also good that we have a wide spread here. Many of these studies also were fairly small, with just 6 or 9 or 10 participants. However, these small studies were all done in a crossover design, which means that each participant completed each dietary phase, and that is a particularly strong study design that requires fewer participants, because each participant can be compared to him or herself. The sixth column shows whether protein intake was matched between the two intervention diets, and then you'll note that some rows are shaded. In those studies, all food and drinks were provided to participants, so these studies were particularly well controlled, and we can have a bit more confidence that participants followed these intervention diets. And then in the last column, I show the overall impact of the diets on insulin sensitivity, and specifically on which diet insulin sensitivity was higher. So if the hypothesis were true that high-carb diets trigger insulin resistance, we would expect that insulin sensitivity was consistently higher on low-carb diets. You can see readily that this was not the case. In two studies led by Bishop and von Frankenberg, we even see higher insulin sensitivity on the high-carb diet, and both were high-quality studies in which all food was provided and insulin sensitivity was measured by the gold standard clamp. There were also two studies led by Kirk and Shokalingam that showed higher insulin sensitivity on the low-carb diets. Both were also good studies, and both also employed the clamp to measure insulin sensitivity. Then we have the study by Lundsgaard, which showed mixed results. To explain, from a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, we can get different measures of insulin sensitivity: systemic insulin sensitivity and hepatic insulin sensitivity. Lundsgaard and colleagues observed lower systemic insulin sensitivity, but higher hepatic insulin sensitivity following the low-carb diet. So that's why I rated this result as mixed in the table. All of the other studies were what we call null. They did not detect a significant differential effect of the intervention diets on insulin sensitivity. And some of these were large studies, such as those by Gardner and colleagues and Sachs and colleagues. There are several more studies we could discuss here, but these either compared diets that were fairly similar in their carb content, they had major study design or reporting flaws, or they were conducted in patients with manifest type 2 diabetes. I did review these as well and do list them in the blog post if you'd like to read up on them. However, considering these studies would not change our overall conclusions, as results in these trials were also pretty mixed. Summary and conclusions. Considering the cumulative evidence, chronic hyperinsulinemia as in clamp studies or in patients with insulinoma does seem to cause insulin resistance. However, this does not seem to translate to the normal ups and downs in insulin levels that result from eating a high-carb diet. In studies that controlled body weight or matched the degree of weight loss, insulin sensitivity was not consistently higher on low-carb diets, and high-carb diets did not clearly cause insulin resistance. Now, why may it be that chronic hyperinsulinemia in clamp studies or patients with insulinoma triggers insulin resistance, while eating a high-carb diet does not? A high-carb diet should clearly result in higher blood insulin concentrations throughout the day. For one, the nature of hyperinsulinemia in clamp studies and insulinoma patients is chronic, with insulin levels elevated for many hours to days or even weeks. That's very different from the regular ups and downs in blood insulin levels that occur with eating a high-carb diet. It is also possible that other components of high-carb or low-carb diets balance out any effect the carb-induced elevations in blood insulin may have. Because when people eat these low-carb and high-carb diets, in these research studies as well as in real life, they don't eat isolated carbs or fats. They eat lots of bread, rice, pasta, and fruit on the high-carb diet, or dairy, meat, nuts, oils, butter, and cream on the low-carb diet. We should be clear that even though investigators designed these diets to differ in their carb and fat content, the resulting diets also differ in numerous other ways, many of which could also affect insulin sensitivity. In other words, it is possible that the normal up and down in blood insulin levels that results from eating more carbohydrates does cause some insulin resistance, but that this effect is balanced out by some other component of the diets. That may also explain why there is so much variability in the study results between the studies. It basically suggests that some hidden factor or factors are at play, and that may well be simply because each study team may have implemented these diets slightly differently. From the existing studies, we cannot confidently determine why some studies show this and others that. What we can say clearly, however, is that in weight-stable people, whether we eat a lot of carbs or almost none, will have very little to no impact on insulin sensitivity per se. Because if a high-carb diet always triggered insulin resistance, then this effect would reliably show up in all or at least most of these studies. The fact that the carb versus fat content of the diet does not seem to have any major impact on insulin sensitivity may be disappointing to some, because if lowering carb intake reliably improved insulin sensitivity, we would have a fairly easy tool in our tool belt to treat insulin resistance. It could also be seen as a positive, however, because these data give people more options in their dietary choices without risking insulin resistance. In other words, if your diet is high in carbs for whatever reason, there is no good reason to think that this will make you insulin resistant per se, as is often asserted. I also want to be clear that these data should not be seen as suggesting that all high-carb diets are good choices for everyone. Many food sources of carbohydrates, such as refined grains and added sugars, are highly glycemic, low in fiber, and provide little in terms of micronutrients. The data discussed here should not give anyone the impression that eating such foods in large quantities has a neutral effect on their health. Most of the studies considered here included whole food-based sources of carbohydrates, such as whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and fruit. And it is important to be clear that the impact on insulin sensitivity, and other health metrics potentially as well, of a high-carb diet rich in refined grains and added sugar may well be worse. It is also clear that high-carb diets may be problematic for people with glucose intolerance, such as prediabetes and particularly manifest diabetes, not because they trigger insulin resistance, but because they are highly glycemic. These data should also not be seen as suggesting that low-carb diets do not offer any benefits for blood sugar regulation. The fact that low-carb diets consistently help people lose weight is a key benefit, and the low glycemic load of low-carb diets is an additional intrinsic advantage for people with impaired glucose tolerance. Simply put, if someone is glucose intolerant, that means they cannot safely keep blood sugar levels within the normal range. And in that case, reducing the amount of glucose that needs to be handled after every meal would seem like a good idea. We'll talk about this in much more detail in a separate video later. To conclude, the available data strongly suggest that continuously high blood insulin concentrations, as in a clamp or in patients with an insulinoma, cause insulin resistance in these settings. However, the physiologically normal up and down in blood insulin levels that occurs with eating a high-carb diet does not seem to independently trigger insulin resistance, and neither do low-carb diets seem to provide a unique insulin sensitizing effect in situations where body weight and fat mass are stable. Allow me one last remark. I commonly see people argue that carbs cause insulin resistance, or that a low-carb diet reverses insulin resistance by citing one or two specific studies. I similarly see people claim that high-carb diets improve insulin sensitivity. As you can see in this table, it is possible to find one or two studies in support of any position. It is critical to be clear that this is not an evidence-based approach. Evidence-based means that we are considering the entirety of the cumulative evidence, not just the few studies that support our opinion. As you can see from the table, real science is often a lot more messy and less conclusive than some of the simple narratives we're often exposed to these days want to make us believe. With that, let me remind you again that you can find a more detailed discussion of the science in the blog post, including all references. As always, the link is in the description box below the video. If you got value out of this video, please leave a like, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and consider sharing this video with others you think may be interested in content about nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic disease. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for watching. Take care.